forward in the different parts to a cell, we need to look at the external cell membrane and cell wall. And these are items that we have heard of, but we need to know a little bit more about them because they're a little bit more complex than just saying that they're the boundary that separates the cell from its surroundings. So the first item we want to look at is the cell wall. Now here's another difference between plants and animals. This is only found in plants and fungi and in protists, which are single-celled organisms, but they're not found in animal cells, so we don't find them in our cells. But the cell wall, we know that this is a plant, for instance, because of the really large vacuole right here. But we know that this would also be a plant because you notice that it has two layers. It has this really thin, what would be kind of the yellow orangish layer that goes all the way around. But then it has this thicker green layer. And that's the very outside of this particular cell. So we know that this is the cell wall. And the job is for protection. Just like your skin protects your body, the job of the cell wall would be for protection, and it also helps maintain the shape of the cell. It is thicker than the cell membrane. You can see that in the picture. So again, it does allow for a lot of structure, a lot of support. Now, something that all cells have would be a cell membrane. So this is what, if you have a cell wall and a cell membrane, the cell wall comes first, the cell membrane's on the inside of that. For us, for animals, the cell membrane is the very first layer that we would encounter as far as protection-wise. And its main job is to control the traffic. What can come in, what can go out, and the cell membrane helps control what can come in and out of the cell. We also say that the cell membrane is selectively permeable. In order for something to be permeable, that means it's allowed to go through it. Selectively, certain things can, certain things cannot. So the cell membrane controls what can and cannot come into the cell or leave. And it's made up of three main parts, and we'll move on to other slides as we get into each of those parts. But you definitely need to know that the cell membrane controls what comes in and out of the cell, so that job is definitely a key one to know. Now, when we look at the parts, I know this is a little blurry, but we're going to be looking at these objects right here that kind of cut through the cell. They're very large. And notice that there's different types and shapes of those. We're also going to be looking at this layer. Really, it's two layers, but these are the phospholipids with the heads and the tails that point inward toward each other. And then we're going to be looking at these structures that are on the outside. Kind of reminds me of a cactus, but these are carbohydrates. So those are the three main groups, and you'll have notes on each of those starting with this slide. So we're going to look at lipids first, and that's because lipids really do make up the majority of your cell membrane. If I go back to this picture, look at every single one of these goldish balls across the top, and then again think about the whole inside here. They're all the way around. So we definitely have more of those than anything else, and those are the lipid layers. This picture is a different color, but you can see how all of those balls are connected side by side. Those are the hydrophilic heads, and then the tails pointing inward. Those are the ones that do not like water. So there's like a no water layer right here. So they're pointing away from the water. And we've already talked about phospholipids in the first unit when we talked about carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. So we already know just a little bit about their shape. But their job is to provide movement and flexibility. Even when I look at this picture, I think of like the outside of like a kickball or something. Like you can press on it and it has some give to it. I look at this picture and I think if I put my hand on top of that, right here and push down, it would bend. It would have some give to it. It wouldn't just pop because it was so full. So it allows for flexibility. It allows the cell to be able to move. And like we mentioned, the heads point toward the water, so there's water out here outside the cell, but you also have water inside of your cell as well. So the heads point toward water and the tails point away from water. Now another component of your cell membrane is lipids. And the second component we're going to look at are proteins. And proteins are these large, in this picture they're purple, but notice that there's several different types and shapes. So the protein helps determine the function of the cell membrane, and so we said that the cell membrane can kind of control what comes in and out, and the proteins really help with this process. So different cells are going to contain different proteins. So your red blood cells are going to have different proteins on it than, for instance, a stomach cell or a nerve cell. Skin cells, they're different, and the proteins will help determine what needs to come into that cell and what can leave. So we're just going to look at two different types of proteins. There's more than two, but transport proteins are these ones that have the channels. So if you look at, it even says channel protein, it's really a transport protein. But the channel is where the piece of material can move across the cell membrane. So a piece of material can use that kind of like a road, and it can come in or it can go out depending on which way it needs to go. So transport proteins help things kind of shuttle across. Then you also have signal proteins, and the signal protein has a certain binding site on it. You can see right here that there's like a little notch out of that particular protein, and they're calling it a receptor protein. What that means is that there is an object out here, kind of like our enzymes and substrate bonds to the enzyme. There will be a little signal that comes in here, and it will bond in that location, and that will trigger this protein for something to happen inside of the cell. And the work is not going to happen inside of the cell until that particular signal has bonded to our protein, okay, at that receptor site. And that again triggers something inside of the cell to happen. And this is the way that insulin and glucose work. Glucose wants to be able to come inside the cell. You need sugar in order to make energy. But until insulin docks and bonds to one of these proteins, nothing is allowed inside of the cell at that point in time. So once that trigger happens, then the cell has some certain devices that it will open up to allow the glucose in. So very specific, they're very touchy. They don't just let anything in and out. It has to kind of go through the right channel. The third item that makes up our cell membrane are carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are really used for cell recognition. So maybe I could recognize you by your hair color and your height. Maybe you have a favorite baseball cap you always wear, so when I see you across the room or across the gymnasium, I recognize you. You have certain characteristics. Well, carbohydrates are very unique and give the cell recognition. So if two cells come in contact with each other, which is very important, especially with your immune system, getting rid of the cells it doesn't recognize or cells that are dangerous, you need to be able to recognize each other so that your immune system does not destroy good cells in your body, which can sometimes happen. So this is how your immune system works. This is how they tell cells apart. Carbohydrates come in different shapes. You can see some Y shapes, some that have little branches even off of that. Each carbohydrate helps to give it recognition, and each of your blood cell types, for instance A blood, B blood, AB, and O, they all have different carbohydrates on the surface, which is why you cannot just donate blood to anybody, because certain bloods, when they mix, they don't get along well, and they can actually clump up and can be deadly if it's not caught soon enough. It can be very dangerous. But each of your cells has a recognition code, and they don't get along with all the other cells, and that's how cells can tell each other apart, is through these carbohydrate chains.